I'm Ara Sarafian. I'm the Executive Director of the Gomidas Institute, and I'm currently based in London, UK. Today is a happy event for us because we are releasing Dr. Gerard Libaridian's latest work, A Precarious Armenia, the Third Republic, the Karabakh conflict, the genocide politics, and genocide politics, published by the Institute. When Dr. Libaridian approached me potentially for the Institute to publish his work, I was thrilled. Dr. Libaridian is one of the leading academics, intellectuals, and statesmen of my generation. When I was a student in the United States, I've actually attended many of his talks. At that time, he was at the Zorian Institute in Boston. He was a founding member, and he went on to become the advisor to the first president of Armenia, Levante Bedrosian, between 1991 and 97. When I looked at his work, I found it insightful, forthright, thought-provoking, and highly political, and I mean that in a positive way. Dr. Libaridian does not mince his words. He argues his points well, and he invites critical engagement of very serious issues. We were also lucky at the Gomidas Institute because much of the pre-press work for this volume was actually done by Antares Media in Yerevan. This is part of a 5-volume set, and this is the third one in English translation. So Antares did much of the pre-publication work. We were lucky enough to publish it. And the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation also covered the costs of the translation and other work as well. So thank you to both organizations for their critical role in making this volume possible. Well, Dr. Libaridian is, like I said, he's a well-grounded academic and political activist statesman. He has got a long list of books to his credit, as well as even longer list of articles in major journals. He is a founding member of the Zorian Institute in Boston, Massachusetts, and he has taught history for many years at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So other than his academic work, he's best known for his involvement in regional issues surrounding Armenia, peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as establishing better relations between Turkey and Armenia. As I mentioned before, he does not shirk from speaking out, and some of his harshest criticism or critiques concern the Armenian diaspora itself and diaspora organizations. So he invites discussion on critical issues that are still of significant relevance for us today. I look forward to Dr. Libaridian's presentation now. He will give us he will tell us about his latest work for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will proceed from there with a question and answer session. So thank you, Gerard.
Thank you, Ara, for that kind introduction, and also for acceding to my request to publish this work. Thank you for everyone joining us on a Sunday. Unless there are people from Australia or elsewhere, I think it's Sunday everywhere. And I'd like to greet people I know, and I seem to know some of you, although I won't be able to say hello individually. This is 10 p.m. in Yerevan. This is my 4th month here, and it's a pleasure to speak from Armenia on issues relevant to Armenia. I have 3 items I would like to cover. First, to present the book in its contents briefly, and then discuss the 2-3 major themes in the book, and finally some comments which may seem to be of a personal nature, but which are in fact important because historians have their own history, although historians like to cover them because it gives them more of an aura of mystery. But historians are people, and readers should understand a little bit of the development, intellectual development, if not other, of the historian. Now, this book is a big one. It's over 600 pages, and it's got 44 articles and interviews that range from 1977 to 2022. It has 5 parts, 3 of which are the fundamental themes: the Third Republic, Karabakh conflict, and Turkish-Armenian issues, but then 2 additional parts that relate to the 2020 war, and I'll talk about that now. The Third Republic section, part 1, has 13 chapters, and they basically cover Armenia's foreign and security policies, its choices, its options, and at the end, the lack of options. And it covers issues of as substantial as does Armenia have a strategic significance, to the situation of emigration that has been a problem since the birth of the Third Republic. And if you will remember, well, some of you will, toward the end of the 2020 war, the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, was standing and saying, we are out of human resources, that there weren't enough fighters. And that was something that was predictable, considering the history of the Republic. The second part is the Karabakh conflict itself. And I'd like to bring to your attention 3 items there. One is 1988, when the Karabakh movement started. Some of you who were part of the Zorian community, the Institute community, will remember that in May of '88, I visited Armenia, witnessed the demonstrations, and wrote a 28-page report, which was distributed to the members of the Institute, supporters and members. And I have included that in the book so that you could, on your own, trace the development of the movement to the Republic, to war, on your own, going back to a 1988 study of mine regarding it. Then another article, which is very important, is 2012, I was invited to Baku for the 3rd or 4th time to do a lecture, which I suggested be turned into a conference. And I had a public lecture there, public presentation, and answered questions. Now, this also would be of special interest, since we do not have many people, Armenians, who visit Baku, and especially go there and have a public lecture and reaction from the public. That could be of interest. And then the third item in this section is a lengthy article, which was ready to be published before the war, but the war started and I didn't release it. And that is how to think about the Karabakh problem, or how not to think about it. And it's a fundamental, basic, I consider seminal look at what was wrong with the way we were dealing with the conflict. The third part has the Turkish-Armenian issues, 13 articles, beginning with a 1977 article I wrote against one of the first major Western denialists, Gwyn Dyer, but also a couple of articles that might interest you that have been published but not widely distributed. And one is my understanding of going a few years back of Erdogan's view of the Armenian issue, and that is titled Erdogan's Armenian Problem. And then followed by a response I gave to then Foreign Minister Davutoglu, who had published a piece on just memory, and I countered that with pointing out the problems in his thinking. And then also some articles that were in Armenian originally and that's the politics of genocide recognition. Then the two other parts are our march toward war, as if blinded, although there were many of us who did warnings that we are moving toward war, and the problems with our negotiating and policy positions. And these are three pieces. And then three other pieces that I have written since the war regarding particularly what went wrong with the negotiations, but also whether we learned any lessons, and if the lessons we learned are really relevant to our current situation, or are we repeating the patterns of thinking that led us to war to begin with. Now, this is a large book, as I said, but since these are all in individual forms, that is 44 chapters, they can be read individually, out of order, and I think they will not you will not miss anything when you read it. Now, there is the introduction, which brings everything together. That is the main themes, which are the dominance of Turkey and the genocide in Armenian political thought in the last 50, 70 years, the consequences of the way we perceive the genocide. And briefly, I've come to a very basic conclusion some time ago with regard to understanding the genocide. There are two basic ways of doing it. One is what might be called the essentialist approach, which means that the genocide happens because Turks are born assassins, they're murderers, they're genocidists, and by extension, so are Azerbaijanis, that it has nothing to do with what we say or do, or what we don't say and don't do. That is one avenue, which often underlies the approach of some of our nationalists. The second is that there were explanations that were historical, and that the genocide was a matter of a historically explained factors that help us understand it, and which then allow us to think of a policy. If you believe in the first kind of interpretation, you don't need a foreign policy, and you are condemned to depend on others. If you think it's a historical issue, then you try to analyze and see if there's anything you can do, and if there are any openings that are coming from Turkey or Azerbaijan. So this is a very fundamental issue that is at the bottom, at the root of what I do. The second theme is the interrelationship between the past, present, and the future. That is, more than many other people, nations, we interlace the past. If we have a particular interpretation of the genocide, then we go to, we justify our present policies, and also we close the future to limited possibilities. And then if we want to justify our policies today, we interpret the past in a way that justifies our current policy. So the third theme is the reliance on outside forces to solve our problems. And this has begun with going back centuries, including Hagop Chugaetsi in the 16th century, Israel Lori, Joseph Emin, Josep Emin, and going all the way to the San Stefano, Berlin treaties, Sèvres Treaty, all these, what started as eventually what was labeled as the Armenian question, then it became the Armenian cause, and all of this saying that in order to do anything, we must rely on others, we beg others, we ask others, And this has come to today with the recognition of the genocide. We beg other countries to do it, and we pay a price for it. So the idea is whether we can rely on anyone or not, and I personally don't think we can. Just look at the people we are going now to the West and the US and asking them to solve our problems. And look, yesterday or 2 days ago, Aliyev's press conference with Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO, where practically NATO said Azerbaijan being under the protection of Turkey and Turkey being a member of NATO, then practically Azerbaijan is NATO. Now, this is not just a matter of the West, but also of Russia. We relied on Russia to protect Karabakh and Lachin, and obviously we cannot, because Russia cannot protect Lachin and it cannot protect Karabakh because it has no mandate to do so. It's just a presence. So my point is that we have to realize that this waiting for a savior. Russia didn't work. We go to US. US doesn't work. We rely on Macron's words, which eventually mean nothing. He was asked just 2-3 days ago in Marseille, you said you support us, but what have you done? And all he had to say is that I have put more pressure on Aliyev than others, but nothing practical. And then, of course, in Aliyev's view, France is the least reliable of Western partners. Now, as many of you know, my writings cannot be placed strictly in one discipline or another, history, politics. My writing is very fluid. It is not to serve history. It is not to serve political science. It is to answer questions that have been on my mind for a long time. That's why I say that historians have their history, and every historian, I hope, but it has been the case with me, has a journey to travel. That's why I have articles from the beginning from 1977. Fundamentally, I have tried to deal with this necessary distinction between what we call the azg, the nation, and the state, which have been in conflict since at least the 4th century. The state is geographically defined, clearly observable, with clear responsibilities to those who lead it, whether democratically or not. A nation does not have a geography. A nation is 3 Armenians in China having a church or a club, and these two have absolutely different priorities. And what Ara referred to as my criticism of the diaspora is the attempt by many diasporan organizations to neglect this fundamental difference. And I think for 50 years or more that I've been dealing with our history and politics and decision-making process, I've been shedding a lot of the walls and obstacles that made it difficult for me at age 20 or 25 or 30 to really see through some of the issues that have never been raised or were not raised, at least to my knowledge. And now we face this problem again. I heard in California, one of the party leaders say, we are doing this, all of this for Armenia. What has Armenia done for us? And the equation of Armenia with as just another place creates problems, at least for me. I must confess that I do not feel I've reached the end of that journey. Hopefully, I'm finishing the last chapter of my next two books, one Armenian, one English, on reflections on our history and historiography. Maybe when I'm working on that, maybe I'll have, I will be closer to some conclusions, but I can say that it's the more I've worked, the more I've lectured, the more I've written and thought and observed, and for 7 years accidentally been part of the building of the state, the more I think we are not raising the fundamental issues, and I'm trying to raise those issues. I think that's why my 20 minutes, Ara.
Well, let me start, Gerard. I was surprised that you put emphasis on the genocide issue and Turkey. Have you ever? How would you assess that? Perhaps the problem with Turkish-Armenian relations is also the ideology of the Turkish state. It's not because essentialist. I mean, there are indicators in terms of Turkish state institutions, practices that are by definition anti-minority. We can't. The question is, how much room does that leave us to be more engaging and have an impact on Turkey itself, to create a space for realistic reconciliation? There are obviously people open to that, but Turkey is still by and large what we consider an assimilationist and a militarized state. I mean, that's what the Kurds would say. We like to believe that we can resolve our issues vis-a-vis the Turkish state, or I should say the Armenian state should. I consider diaspora separately. But perhaps Armenia is between a hard place and a hard place. I mean, isn't that an essential, isn't that where you have to make a critical judgment? I mean, do we have options just because?
Well, the problem of a minority in Turkey is a very different problem than the problem of Armenia as a state and Turkey as a state. It's true that Turkey is assimilationist, but so far it does accept the Armenian minority as part of Turkey. Sometimes more pressures, sometimes less pressures. But that is not the problem of Armenia to start with. Armenia can help, Armenia can harm, but Armenia is a state, and a state has a different agenda. Then there are Armenians in other parts of the world where there may be pressures, they suffer. Armenia can help, but that's not Armenia's reason for its existence. Although, if an Armenia exists as a state, with some degree at least of sovereignty, then in case of trouble, the Armenians in Turkey could come to Armenia. But if there's no state, there's nowhere else to go. So now, in terms of Turkish attitudes, there are, of course, it is militarized, and the attempts to get away from it are sometimes successful, sometimes not. But there has always been a difference between the Armenian nation, okay, from, let's say, 19th century. The purpose of the concerns of the Armenian nation and what were the aims, let's say, of the Enchagians and Tashnakçıoğlu versus what were the aims of the Turkish elite and government. The Turkish government was concerned with its territorial integrity and the defeats it was suffering. It was the idea of saving the state. For us, it was saving the people. And these are very contrary goals that got us to the First World War and the genocide. Now, with regard to Armenia, Turkish policy has changed, of course, from Atatürk's no problems with the neighbors, no peace abroad, peace inside. Now that has changed, but that is not the final world, and it is not necessarily the downfall of Armenia. For 30 years, we have been told, even the Tashnakçıoğlu was against independence because the next day we were going to be massacred, and it's been 30 years now and a little more. and not a single soldier has come to Armenia, Turkish. Not a single kilometer square has been taken. So we have to accept that there is the policy, there are the Turkish goals, and then there's the action, what has happened and what has not happened that should have happened. So my answer would be first to distinguish these two, and then to see what actually has happened. Turkey has, of course, helped Azerbaijan and continues to help. But from the not only Turkish point of view, but the international point of view, what we argued was our right to help and liberate Karabakh Armenians. It was seen as Armenia's invasion of Azerbaijan. Then that's obvious because neither during the First War, nor during the intermediate period, nor during the Second War, nor since has anyone done anything when Azerbaijan has taken military action. They haven't. And they haven't because it's their view. And Turkey has helped them. And beginning with my negotiations with Turkey in the summer of 1992 until I left at the end of 1997, it was very clear, and it has been very clear, that Turkey, that was ready to sign a protocol, decided not to because of Karabakh, and by extension because they want us, they're putting pressure on us to deal with Azerbaijan. But we have to distinguish between what our projection is of Turkey and what Turkey is. In our foreign policy, not just with regard to Turkey, Armenian foreign policy makers more often than not have projected their image of that other country's policies. What we read now in Macron's words is more damaging than what we read in Turkey's words and Russia's role. So it's a general problem which doesn't exculpate Turkey from negative aspects, but also we cannot focus on that while we are making the same mistake in another direction from the others.
If I may follow one more question there. You mentioned Armenia's foreign policy makers. Does Armenia have think tanks? Do you read position papers in government or out of government? I mean, is there this level of sophistication in making such assessments before decisions are taken? Is Armenia such a state, or was it, or is it such a state? You have the insights. Could you say anything along those lines? I mean,
well, during the time I served in the government, we did not really have think tanks, but we have intensive discussions. And I think personally that those intensive discussions within ourselves, within the government, and with some experts whenever we had any, some of us came to the right conclusion that we should sign something intermediate, that we couldn't possibly get independence for Karabakh, and we should have signed with some concessions that would have left much more than this war left. So the thinking was there. The thinking doesn't have to be in a think tank. Now, I would say that the Security Council, of which I was secretary the last 3 years, we did not have a big staff. There was a staff for the National Security Advisor, and Ashod Manucharyan had a big staff, but I never kept a staff other than 4 people that were mostly administrative. But I think we got to the right approach without all the think tanks. Now, eventually, the Security Council expanded, and under Serge Sargsyan, it became part of the Constitution. it was not a body constitutionally mandated during our time. It was an advisory body. Now, since Pashinyan, there is the Security Council that has its own building. There are at least one, maybe more outfits. There are think tanks that are given assignments that do research and provide counsel. I'm not privy as to what is the relationship between Armen Grigoryan, the Secretary of the Security Council, who has that staff, and the Prime Minister. I know they work very closely. The Foreign Ministry, in my view, is still not the strong institution that it is, let's say, in Turkey or France or the US or Russia. But it may get there someplace. For some reason, we have not been able to do that. You see, the think tanks are supposed to produce options, but our options have become very limited. I have seen a lot of other diasporan organizations thinking about think tanks, but the point is that practically speaking, our options are limited now. We had them before 2020. Now Aliyev has these options. But also, if you begin your think tank with some preconceived notions that Turkey is the threat and Turkey is going to attack tomorrow, then you have no options. We don't have that freewheeling debates publicly, and I suspect from what I note in our think tanks, that there is this idea that there is some solution there. And this is very critical for me. There is this notion that there's some solution which we haven't been able to find, but which we will find when we have 15 PhDs who come together, the think tank and the specialists. But the fact is that we went to war, even though there were warnings. For 25 years, we said Azerbaijan is corrupt, Azerbaijanis are not, Hayr Nasser, they don't care about Karabakh, and our army is this or that, despite the fact that all the evidence was to the contrary. So we can have 100 think tanks, and we still will end up with some of the problems, which is mainly that we don't have too many options. There is no idea out there that will save us from the fact that we lost the war. And number two, that we really don't have friends. This is where I begin. I say that we are now at ground zero. We have to start all over again and build the state in a different way, if we can imagine it, and with the limitations that will be there for us.
Thank you. I guess this links to Talim Boskarichan's question. Why would you call it a precarious republic? I guess you just gave the answer to that. So the question isn't just about Karabakh now, right? It's about the state of Armenia.
Absolutely. And I'm not, frankly, I'm not too concerned about the borders of Armenia. That is the state of Armenia as a state. Azerbaijan has issues and creates issues, but I do not think, and knowing also some of the Azerbaijani leaders and knowing personally Aliyev and his advisor and some of the people around him, I do not think the problem is our borders. There will be minor issues, but it's not our borders. The problem is the degree of sovereignty that we can have, and where should we begin thinking about Armenia? We cannot think about Armenia with foreign government people telling us this and telling us that, and doing nothing. We have to realize where we are, be very realistic, and start rebuilding this state and become something that matters other than being a tool. when we base our policy on foreign support, we are not big enough to benefit from it. The others are much bigger, and we will become tools in the hands of other governments and solve their problems, not ours. The beginning spot must be thinking of where we are now, and we have to decide. We have to decide, Ara, are we part of this region? Which means we have to come to terms with whatever that means and find a way to have peace and stability with our neighbors? Or are we this extraneous element that was placed here somehow by mistake 2,000-3,000 years ago, and that must have this savior outside? You know, the common word that we are surrounded by enemies freezes the thinking process. We have to realize that what we did in the last 30 years is at least as much responsible for where we are as what others did to us. We cannot forget that regardless of the justification and the explanation and the responsibility, political responsibility for militarizing the conflict to begin with, okay, regardless of that, we did take over territory that was not Karabakh, and we expelled about 700,000, which is not 100 people, 700 people, 700,000 people from their home. When you want to understand Azerbaijan, as unpleasant as that is, you have to realize that this was a problem for Azerbaijan. And similar issues. We cannot blame everything on Turkey and Azerbaijan and Russia and the US, while we made we made mistakes and we took actions which we can justify, but we don't want to talk about, because for 25 years, the international community told us there's no independence for Karabakh and the 7 districts must be returned, right? And what did we do? What did we do? And then when the war starts, we go to France and say, do something for us. But France has been telling us, the US has been telling us, look at all the UN resolutions. Look at the Minsk group projects, the plans they have proposed. Look at the Lisbon summit. They have been telling us, we did not listen, but we didn't listen, and then we paid the price for it. And then to think that now we go to them and say, save this and save that.
Well, we have two related questions. Do you expect some Turkish people or Turkish officials to read at least part of your book? And if so, what would you expect them to learn or understand from them? And you could also say that for Armenians in Armenia. Do you see getting through, cutting through the existing debates and having an impact? Or have you seen with the Armenian, first 2 Armenian volumes of your work?
Well, yes, I do expect them to read. I know that my 1991 book, Armenia at the Crossroads, was not only read by Turkish leaders, but I know it was read by then Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel, and he sent me the copy which he read with his signaling what he had read and what he thought about it. You see, for example, that book was important, although it's forgotten, but when Armenia became independent and I started negotiations with them, I realized the fundamental problem was that Turkey had not thought about Armenia at all. They didn't need to think, it was Moscow. And when Armenia became independent and they're looking at this state next to them, they projected their conception of Armenian issues, that is the diasporan agenda. They thought the government here had the same agenda. And my book convinced at least some of the leaders that Armenia is acting as a state and not as a community. Right? Now, that followed my book on the challenge of statehood, which was translated to Armenian French, but also to Turkish, and it had 3 huge printings. It was read by much more than. And now my first book, Armenia, Turkey, Hayastan, Turkey, is being translated to Turkish. So now, this may be a surprise, but I'll tell you that 2-3 years ago, when I went to Antalya to the diplomatic forum organized by then Foreign Minister, high-level Turkish officials, and had over 8 hours of discussions with them, and they couldn't understand what I was telling them as to how important in Armenian thinking is the view of the past, Armenian perception of our own history and past, and that means Turkey's role in our political thinking. And so they started reading things that I wrote, but I know that, for example, the Davutoğlu article that I wrote, it was published in Turkish quarterly policy. It was published there, and in 48 hours, it had 7,000 readings. And I was told by a Turkish advisor, to the government, that a number of ministers asked all their people to read it, not only for the content, but also as to how you argue a point without insulting people. So I do expect this to be read. I have many colleagues in Turkey, in academia, and some outside of academia, and I know that they read carefully what I write, because it does not equate knowing Turkey with insulting Turkey. My Hayre Nasirutyun does not depend on hatred and insults toward Turks or Azeris. It depends on a critical approach toward them and toward our own problems. In Armenia, the first volume was Turkey Hayastan, had a relatively high level of sales, but here in Armenia, people, although we try to keep the price low, but still it's not easy to buy books, especially if they are 400, 600 pages. But I can say that each book is probably read by an average of 3 people, by 3 people, if not more. So I know that because people tell me that. So I expect that people will read, and I can say that that first volume, the second one is relatively new. That's Yerotan Rabedutyun, came out last December, but I know it's being used at the Yerevan State University as a textbook and at American University as a textbook. So, and while I've been here, I have at least one group, different groups of relatively young people, mostly young, but also some older people who want to sit and discuss, and I always avail myself to them. So I think I know the Prime Minister reads it. I know Armen Grigoryan reads the stuff. I know the Foreign Minister looks at least at some of them. So I know that it has an impact.
And one more question here, last one. Do you think Armenia has enough energy to repair itself? Do you think that possibility is a real one, that there's rational elements that will come to realize that actually we need to reset everything within the country as well as with our neighbors? Does it still have that potential, that rational potential?
And more now than before, yes.
Yeah.
More now after the war. where particularly with the younger generations, where some of them were already against the previous policies, but now I see more and more people who have learned a lesson from the war, saying maybe we were on the wrong path. Although there are forces that want to argue that, you see, they attacked again, and so it proves that they're bad people. But I have seen a very, very healthy generation. And a second point, which may be not so obvious, but I think I meet now a lot of people on the street, shop owners, people who stop me and see me in a cafe, they'll stop and talk. A lot of people who disagreed with me. And now they don't think it's important anymore. What they want is stability, peace, and a chance to breathe. And their question is, Ինչ կգարձեք, Baron Libaridian, ինչ պիտի լինի մեր ավական? What do you think, Mr. Libaridian? What will be our future? My butcher was asking whether this country will have economic expansion. And, you know, I explained. And this is, to me, much clearer than my last stay here, October through December last year. I've been here since February, March, April, now June, and it's a very different country. It's a very different country. There is those who disagreed, still it doesn't matter. They come and ask what will happen to us, when are we going to have some peace and stability?
But aren't you afraid that you specifically might be contained, shall we say, with your ideas? I mean, have you been on Armenian television? I mean, it's full of chat shows, left, right, and center. Have they engaged you at that level?
I have been about 3 weeks ago or so. I gave an interview on public television to Bedros Ghazarian, who's considered the best, and you know, about half an hour, and I answered questions very frankly. And apparently it made an impact. Other than that day on YouTube, it was, I think it's now close to 50,000 views just on YouTube. I don't know Facebook and what others. That has moved people. And my main point was, first, we are alone. Secondly, we must start working from scratch, build the house of policy making, brick by brick. And now I know that television is full of people who oppose these views, who oppose any rapprochement, although they have no arguments. It's just a matter of saying Turks are this, Azerbaijanis are that, Russians should do this, and Americans should do that, and, you know, which is not policy and it is not debate.
Would you go to Turkey if you're invited there? And do you think that their foreign policy establishment would be interested in talking to you on the various issues?
I mean, of course, I mean, I don't have any position and I don't want any position. But I would certainly go if they wanted to understand. The key is they should understand what we're about, and we should understand what really they're about from their point of view. Although we may disagree with their assessment, but first you must begin by understanding how they think, what they think. And this is a debate that is indirectly done here. One Turkish specialist professor, I understand, has written a book against my book, a whole book against me. And he was apparently on television and dismissed me as a Turkish, as an expert on Turkey. And publicly I said in that interview, who was right about predicting Turkey's support for Azerbaijan, the kind of support? Who was right about the war? I was right, and they all dismissed the idea of war or welcomed it when I was saying we will go to war and we will lose. And then we will lose much more than what we could have lost with compromise solutions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Libaridian. I mean, I read your book, obviously, and you elaborate on these very points. I hope the book is read and it becomes the focus for discussions. People may not agree with you, but they need to present valid arguments and exercise their own judgment. But in that sense, I hope that the work makes its point that way. You can, as you say, you raise fundamental questions, you look for answers, and if others have better answers, so let them join in the discussion.
I would love to read stuff that is seriously challenging.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that's written, I'm not on Facebook or any other social networks, but I understand after my interview on television, there was a very organized campaign against my views, except that it was not a debate. It was, he's a spy, he's a traitor, he's this and he's that, the same kind of thing that came in 1990s, where the Asparez newspaper in Los Angeles, of which I was editor, by the way, sometime before, an article said, how can you take Libaridian seriously? He's the son of Kebabji Setrak,
Right.
That was the level, and that's fine. I'm very proud of Kebabjis.
Right. Look, in the following months, we hope to create the opportunity for you to address audiences in the United States, but also in Armenia and elsewhere. As a publishers, we'll do whatever we can. I know there are groups of people who are interested, who would like to hear more of you, and I hope that your work sets an agenda or a sensible agenda for future discussion. So the United States will be obvious focus, but I'd like to see you go to Turkey and also a more prominent place in Armenia, where you lead, shall we say, with your questions, and let others again add their own questions and their own answers, because that's the way democracy works.
Incidentally, I am in contact with former and new colleagues in Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, because I think this region has to start thinking of itself as a region and not be torn apart by imagined security guarantees outside. So my position is not, my statements are not just based on reading Asparez.